What if this wasn't just murder? What if it was experimentation? Think about it, a criminology PhD student, someone obsessed with how crimes happen, how criminals think, how they get caught. It was a quiet night in Moscow, Idaho, the kind of quiet that feels safe, predictable, almost boring. Inside a house on King Road, 6 college students moved through their routines, laughing, texting, planning their next day. Nothing felt unusual, nothing felt wrong. 2 of them had just returned from a night out. Another had been scrolling through her phone. Upstairs, the lights slowly went out, one by one. By 2 a.m., the house had settled into silence. But this wasn't the peaceful kind of silence. This was the kind that hides something. Somewhere in the dark, outside that house, someone was watching. Not a random passerby. Not someone lost. Someone who had been there before. Someone who knew the layout, the timing, the patterns. And most chilling of all, someone who had already decided what was going to happen next. There were no alarms, no forced entry, no immediate signs of danger. Just a normal night, quietly turning into something else. Something no one inside that house could see coming. Hours later, the entire country would know this address. But at that moment, it was just another college home, on just another night. And that's what makes it terrifying. Because the most dangerous moments don't feel dangerous at all. They feel normal, right up until they're not. What happened inside that house would leave investigators confused, the public obsessed, and one question echoing louder than anything else. Was this random, or was it planned? Because if it was planned, then this wasn't just a crime, it was something far more calculated, and the first real clue that something was terribly wrong didn't come from what people saw, it came from what they didn't hear. Morning came slowly. Sunlight crept into the house on King Road, touching the same rooms that had gone dark just hours earlier. But something wasn't right. There were no footsteps, no voices, no movement. For a house full of college students, that kind of silence is unnatural. At first, it didn't raise alarms. People sleep in, phones get ignored, doors stay closed. But as time passed, that silence started to feel heavy, uncomfortable, wrong. Calls went unanswered, messages stayed unread, and eventually, someone made a decision that would change everything. They called for help. When responders arrived, nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to walk into. Inside that house, 4 lives had been taken. No sign of a struggle that echoed outside, no loud chaos that woke the entire house. Just silence. That's what made this case instantly different, because crimes like this don't usually happen quietly. They don't happen without someone hearing something. But here, 2 people in the same house survived, and they heard almost nothing. That detail alone would haunt investigators. How does something this violent stay this quiet? Was the attacker careful, experienced, or was there something about this house, this layout, this timing, that made it possible? As the investigation began, one thing became clear. This wasn't going to be simple. There were no obvious suspects, no immediate answers, just a brutal crime scene, and a timeline full of gaps. And then, investigators discovered something that shifted the entire direction of the case. A detail so small, it could have been missed entirely, but once they saw it, they knew they weren't looking for just anyone. They were looking for someone very specific. At first, the scene looked almost too clean. No broken windows, no forced entry, no clear sign of how someone got in or out. But crimes like this, they always leave something behind. You just have to know where to look. Investigators began processing every inch of the house, slowly, carefully, methodically, and that's when they found it. A small object, easy to overlook, but impossible to ignore once you understand what it means. A knife sheath, left behind. It didn't belong to any of the victims, which meant one thing: it belonged to the person who did this. And on that sheath was something even more valuable: DNA. That single piece of evidence changed everything. Because now, this wasn't just a mystery, it was a hunt. But here's where it gets strange. The DNA didn't match anyone in the system. No criminal record, no direct hit. Whoever this person was, They had never been caught before, but that didn't mean they were invisible. Investigators turned to a different method, one that had solved cases long thought impossible: genetic genealogy. By tracing family connections through DNA databases, they weren't just looking for a suspect anymore. They were building a path straight to him, and slowly, that path started to narrow, closer and closer, until it pointed toward someone no one expected. A man who didn't fit the usual profile. A man who didn't just study crime, he studied how criminals think. And that's when the case took a turn no one saw coming, because the person they were about to focus on might have understood this investigation better than the investigators themselves. It wasn't a face, not a fingerprint, not even a name. It was a car, a white sedan, caught on surveillance cameras near the house, moving through the area in the early hours of the morning. At first it didn't seem like much. Cars pass by all the time, but this one, it didn't just pass through, it circled, again and again. Slow movements, repeated routes, like someone waiting, watching, timing something. Investigators tracked every camera they could find: homes, traffic lights, nearby streets. Piece by piece, they built a timeline. The car appeared before the murders, it lingered, and then, it disappeared right after. That wasn't coincidence, that was behavior. Once they identified the make and model, a white Hyundai Elantra, the search intensified. Thousands of similar vehicles existed, but only one had been in the exact right place, at the exact wrong time. And then came the break. A match. Not perfect at first, but close enough to investigate further. The car was registered to a man living just miles away from the crime scene. A man who on the surface seemed ordinary, quiet, reserved, intelligent. But as investigators dug deeper, that surface started to crack, because this wasn't just any owner of a white sedan. This was someone who had spent years studying crime, not as a criminal, but as a student. And suddenly, the question changed. This wasn't just, who did this? It became, did he plan this better than anyone expected? Because if that car belonged to him, then he wasn't just near the scene, he was orbiting it, waiting, and maybe understanding exactly what he was about to do. His name was Brian Kohberger, a PhD student in criminology, someone who didn't just learn about crime, he analyzed it, studied patterns, behavior, motives, the kind of person who writes papers on how criminals think, the kind of person who understands mistakes so they can be avoided. At least that's the idea. People who knew him described him as quiet, sometimes intense, someone who kept to himself, nothing outwardly alarming, nothing that screamed danger. But investigators weren't looking at personality, they were looking at patterns. Phone records showed something strange. In the weeks leading up to the murders, his phone had been near the victim's house multiple times. Late at night, repeated visits. That wasn't random, that was familiarity. And then, on the night of the murders, his phone went dark. No signal, no movement, nothing recorded. For a critical window of time, he disappeared digitally, but right after, the signal came back, and his phone began moving again, away from the area. That gap, that silence, it lined up almost perfectly with the timeline of the crime. To investigators, that wasn't just suspicious, it was strategic, because someone who studies crime would know one thing: phones track everything. So if you were going to do something like this, turning it off wouldn't be a mistake, it would be a decision. And that raises a chilling possibility. This wasn't impulsive, it wasn't emotional, it may have been calculated, step by step, but even the most careful plans have flaws, and Kohberger may have made one mistake he couldn't erase. Because, while he could control his phone, he couldn't control everything he left behind. By now, investigators had multiple threads: the car, the phone data, the DNA from the sheath. Individually, each one raised questions. Together, they started forming a picture, but it still wasn't enough. Not yet. They needed confirmation, so they watched, quietly, carefully. Koberger had left Idaho, crossed state lines, traveled across the country with his father. On the surface, it looked normal. A holiday trip. Nothing unusual, but investigators weren't guessing anymore. They were building a case. In Pennsylvania, surveillance teams began tracking his movements, every stop, every habit, every detail. And then, they saw something that stood out. He was cleaning his car, not casually, meticulously, wiping surfaces, paying attention to areas most people ignore. To investigators, that behavior meant one thing. He wasn't just being clean. He might have been trying to erase something, and if that was true, then time was running out, because evidence doesn't last forever. DNA can degrade, traces can disappear, so they moved in, but before making an arrest, they needed one final piece, something undeniable, something that would connect him directly to the crime. And that final piece came from something as ordinary as trash, because what people throw away can reveal more than what they keep, and what they were about to find would bring this entire investigation to a breaking point. Investigators didn't rush in blindly, they waited, watched, and when the moment was right, they moved quietly. Outside Koberger's family home in Pennsylvania, agents recovered trash. Something most people wouldn't think twice about. But inside that trash was DNA. And when they tested it, it matched. Not directly to him at first, but to his family line. That was enough. Enough to confirm what they had been building for weeks. The sheath found at the crime scene, the DNA on it. It pointed straight to him. At that moment, the case shifted. This wasn't a theory anymore. This was real, and investigators knew. They were no longer watching a suspect. They were preparing to arrest a killer. But even now, one question remained. If he was this careful, this calculated, why leave the sheath behind? Because that single mistake would cost him everything. It happened in the early hours, dark, quiet, controlled. Law enforcement surrounded the house. No chaos, no warnings, just precision. Then, movement. They went in. Brian Koberger was taken into custody without resistance. No dramatic escape. No final stand. Just silence. The same kind of silence that surrounded the crime. But what he said next caught attention. According to reports, he asked, "Has anyone else been arrested?" Not, "What's going on?" Not, "Why am I here?" That question, specific, strange, calculated, it raised eyebrows immediately, because it suggested something unsettling. Either he was confused, or he was thinking ahead, trying to understand what investigators knew, trying to measure how much evidence they had. And that moment, it added a new layer to the case, because this wasn't just about what happened, it was about what he believed he could get away with. But as the evidence stacked higher, it became clear whatever he believed was starting to collapse, and the deeper investigators looked, the more disturbing the picture became. This is where the case becomes more than evidence. It becomes psychological, because everything about this crime raises one possibility. What if this wasn't just murder? What if it was experimentation? Think about it. A criminology PhD student, someone obsessed with how crimes happen, how criminals think, how they get caught, someone who may have studied mistakes, so he wouldn't make them. The late-night visits to the house, the careful timing, the phone going dark, these aren't random actions. They suggest planning, control, execution. But then, the sheath, left behind, a single object, that unraveled everything. And that contradiction is what makes this case so disturbing, because it forces a question no one can fully answer. Was this a perfectly planned crime, undone by one mistake? Or was the mistake always going to happen? Because no one is as perfect as they think, and if that's true, then maybe this case isn't about intelligence at all. Maybe it's about something much simpler, something far more human, and far more dangerous. Even now, the case isn't finished. Trials, arguments, evidence, all of it still unfolding, but the story has already left its mark. 4 lives lost, a community changed forever, and a case that refuses to feel simple. Because at its core, this story isn't just about what happened, it's about why. Why this house? Why these victims? Why that night? And the truth is, we may never fully know. That's what makes this different. There's no clean ending, no clear resolution, just pieces, evidence, behavior, theory, and somewhere in between all of that, the truth, or at least, something close to it. Because cases like this don't just end in courtrooms. They stay in people's minds, in questions that don't go away, in details that don't quite fit, and in one final thought that lingers long after everything else fades. If someone can study crime this closely, understand it this deeply, and still do something like this, then what does that say about the line between knowing and becoming?